All right, so we are going to get started. Want to make sure we're right on time so we can maximize the time for tonight, so we can make sure that our panelists and moderator get the most out of the time that we have. So I would like to welcome everyone to tonight's event. I had the pleasure of hearing a little bit about the event before started, and we are definitely in for a treat tonight. So first, my name is Dorico Simons. I am the Director of Opportunity and Belonging here at NSCAD. I'd like to thank Ioka Junaid and Kimberly Johnson as the ASL interpreters for tonight. As well, I would like to thank Melanie Colissimo for organizing logistics, and as well thank Anik Gaudet for handling tech for the night. This event will be recorded and will be viewable through the NSCAD Facebook page, as well as the ANA Facebook page. And if there are any tech issues along the way, please comment on the post, as I will be monitoring the page and be able to get the comments and feed them to the moderator and the panelists. And so as well, if there are any questions, please comment on the post, because I will be monitoring them and as well as tech issues. So I'm going to go through a land acknowledgement, certainly as appropriate. And so, we understand that people are tuning in from different parts of Canada and as well different parts of the world. We recognize that the land acknowledgement might be different depending on where you are in the world. Being that this talk is based in Halifax or Jabuktuk, it's appropriate that we provide the land acknowledgement for this area. And so NSCAD is in Mi'kma'ki, on the ancestral and unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq Nation. This territory is covered by the treaties of peace and friendship, which Mi'kmaq and Maliseet peoples first signed with the British Crown in 1725. The treaties did not deal with surrender of lands and resources, but in fact recognized Mi'kmaq and Maliseet title and established the rules for what was to be an ongoing relationship between nations. And so with that land acknowledgement, I'm going to go in to introduce our moderator. Our moderator is NSCAD's Dr. Charmaine Nelson. Charmaine Nelson is a professor of art history in a Tier 1 Canada Research Chair in Transatlantic Black Diasporic Art and Community Engagement at Nova Scotia Art and Design, or NSCAD. Where she is also the founding director of the first ever institute focused on the study of Canadian slavery. Prior to this appointment, she worked at McGill University in Montreal for 17 years. Dr. Nelson has made groundbreaking contributions to the fields of visual culture of slavery, race and representation, and Black Canadian studies. She has published 7 books, including Slavery, Geography, and the Empire in 19th Century Marine Landscapes of Montreal and Jamaica. She is actively engaged with lay audiences through her media work, including ABC, CBC, CTV, BBC, One and Fake or Fortune, and PBS Finding Your Roots. She blogs for Huffington Post Canada and writes for The Walrus. In 2017, she was the William Lyon Mackenzie King Visiting Professor of Canadian Studies at Harvard University. We're very lucky to have Dr. Nelson here at NSCAD, and as well have her moderating tonight's panel with a slew of amazing panelists. So with that, I will pass it over to you, Dr. Nelson.
Thank you, Dorico. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. I'm so excited to welcome you all. Thank you for taking time out of your busy schedules to be with us. I know you could be doing other things. I'm thrilled because this is the first event of the Institute for the Study of Canadian Slavery, and I'm very excited that it is an event that centers the wonderful research of graduate students who are doing amazing and interesting primary research in different areas. And interestingly, as you'll see, all of their papers touch upon the issue of slave resistance in different ways in different regions. I'd also like to just say my own set of thank yous. I want to thank the former president, Aife McNamara, and the VP Academic and Research, Dr. Ann Barbara Graff, for recruiting me and for supporting the development of the Institute. I also want to heartily thank Dr. Sarah McKinnon, our current wonderful president, for her continuing support, guidance, and leadership across the whole university, and also for her ongoing support for the Institute for the Study of Canadian Slavery. I also want to thank Dorico Simmons, who you just met, again, the first ever director of Opportunity and Belonging here at NSCAD, Dean Martine Duryea-Kopp, Melanie Colissimo, Annie Godet, Bruce Debe, Linda Hutchinson, Kirsty McCallum, Kara Holm, and Karen Cope, who all are wonderful and supportive colleagues in different aspects of the NSCAD landscape. I'm now going to introduce all three of the speakers in alphabetical order, and then we're going to have them speak one after the other for about 15 to 18 minutes. And then at the end, we're going to have a Q&A. Hopefully with all of you in the audience, we'll have questions for the presenters. So I begin with Audrey Authors. Audrey is Jamaican by birth, but has lived in Canada since childhood. She is currently completing her MA in art history at Concordia University in Montreal, and her thesis takes an interdisciplinary perspective, exploring the performance of gender and sexuality in Wilfred Limononius's dance vinyl album covers. Her academic interests include Caribbean art, history, Black activism in art and Black diaspora studies, transatlantic slavery studies, and vinyl album art. And Audrey will be pursuing her PhD in the fall of 2021. The second presenter is Chris J. Gismondi. Chris is a white settler of Scottish and Italian descent from Dish with One Spoon, head of the Lake Treaty number 14, 1806. He is a PhD student at McGill University, and his Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada sponsored doctoral research explores temperate climate slavery and settler colonialism in Upper Canada, which is today known as Ontario, and enslaved women's resistance under gradual abolition through print culture and portrait representation. Finally, Rach Klein is an art historian and artist based on Tashoghe, otherwise known as Montreal. After completing their BA in early modern studies at the University of King's College, Rach went on to do her master's degree in art history at McGill University, where Rach is continuing PhD work. Rach's current academic research focuses on representations of race and power in a collection of 19th century marionettes, and their creative work imagines colorful and strange utopias populated by birds and windows. So those are the three presenters. And we'll begin then giving the floor to Audrey, who will also be sharing her screen with us.
Thank you, everyone. My presentation today is called Firebun or Fireburn, Black Women as Active Agents of Resistance in the Danish West Indies. From transatlantic trade to the present, Black women have been a galvanizing force behind activism and resistance. They have proven themselves to be strategic generals and trailblazers that force societal change. Most of us are familiar with Nanny of the Maroons in Jamaica, Harriet Tubman and Rosa Parks in the United States, Viola Desmond in Canada. These women actively fought for civil rights, social justice, and right to self-determination. However, few have heard of the three queens: Queen Mary Thomas, Queen Axelin Agnes Solomon, Queen Matilda McBean, and Susanna Bottombelly Abramson from the Danish West Indies. They led the largest labor revolt in Danish colonial history. This presentation will use a historiographical framework of the Danish West Indies to examine Queen Mary Thomas's leadership role in the radical crusade that led to the labor revolt known as Firebun in 1878 on St. Croix Island after emancipation. Although slavery ended, slave laws and systems of oppression manifested itself in the labor laws and daily treatment of Blacks. Mary Thomas's name is not as renowned as other Black women revolutionists because the Danish involvement in transatlantic slavery is not disseminated and examined prolifically as their European counterparts. Other factors include language barriers and less significant migration from the Danish West Indies to Denmark. Therefore, there was no great demand to integrate the enslaved history into Danish historical annals. The Three Queens and Susanna Abramson names and narrative need to be rightfully acknowledged and placed among the pantheon of other female stalwarts in the history of Black women as active agents of resistance. The importance of recognizing rebels like Mary Thomas is to empower the past voices that were silenced, as Fuentes says, due to archival violence, and to reshape Black people's narratives. With the current sociopolitical climate that is addressing state-sanctioned systemic racism, activists can draw strength and courage from these women's bravery and tenacity. The Danish West Indies is comprised of 3 islands: St. Croix, St. John, and St. Thomas. The Danish West Indies Guinea Company annexed St. Thomas in 1672, St. John in 1718, and St. Croix was purchased from West India Company in 1733. When the Danish company went bankrupt in 1754, the King of Denmark, Norway, took control of the 3 islands. Denmark sold these islands, now known as the US Virgin Islands, in 1917. Resistance to slavery started from the point of capture on African shores, continuing on board slave ships and to their new locations in the Caribbean. Tactics included running away before boarding the ships and launching mass insurrections, suicide, infanticide, or starving themselves. From 1660 to 1806, the Danes made approximately 400 voyages, transporting at least 120,000 African captives across the Atlantic Ocean, where an estimated 1 in 6 died. Many of the ships were similar to the Fredensborg, 3-mast frigates, cargo ships that were not designed to carry people. Fredensborg was armed with 10 4-pound cannons, 4 half-pound swivel guns, all defensive barriers used to counteract slave insurrection. The most noted slave mutiny in the Danish Atlantic occurred on the slave ship Christiansborg on February 26, 1775. The ship held 357 enslaved and 42 crew members. According to Captain Ferentz's account, the battle started on the 2nd day of sailing. Many of the enslaved were killed. Upon arrival, the slaves that survived were sold to the highest bidders. No concern whatsoever was given to the enslaved families. They were split up and sent to different plantations. Even if families ended up together on the same plantation, they always lived in fear that any member of the family could be sold at any given moment to another plantation. The backbreaking work that the enslaved had to perform caused many of them to die an early death or have severe injuries, which perpetuated the need for the Danish to import more Africans. There was an hierarchy amongst the slave class. There were the field slaves that were responsible for doing the backbreaking work. And we have the craftsmen, the house slaves, and the bombas, who are overseers. The slaves were at the bottom, the field slaves were at the bottom of the echelon, while the bombas were at the top. After the Danish abolished slavery in 1792, they continued to use the enslaved that were already purchased. Dragging their feet, they did not implement abolishment until 1803. In 1848, slaves grew impatient with the delayed process and threatened to burn down Frederiksted if they were not granted their freedom immediately. While freedom was given reluctantly, a labor act was swiftly introduced, which placed several restrictions on the newly freed slaves that left them impoverished, living in subpar conditions and having no political and legal power. Plantation workers were forced to continue to work on the estates and were not able to negotiate improved labor terms, nor could they leave the island to seek better employment. The planters needed these workers to continue sugar production. Employees could only change owners or move but once a year on October 1st, known as Contract Day or Transfer Day. On this particular day in 1878, a day of rejoicing and merriment turned into violence when it was rumored that a farm laborer, John Trotman, was a victim of police brutality that resulted in his hospitalization. It was also speculated that he died, which fueled anger and galvanized the laborers to launch an attack against the police and military, as seen in the Revolt of St. Croix, an illustration showing the laborers, male and female, armed with various raised weapons, charging fearlessly toward the fort. The diagonal treatment of the rioters creates a dynamic visual impact of the insurrection. The laborers, intent on studying their movements, throw stones at the Danish soldiers who retaliate with gunfire. In the right background of the illustration, there's a puff of smoke suggesting the beginnings of a fire. The rioters are not dissuaded. Instead, the violence escalates until soldiers barricade themselves inside the fort. Unsuccessful in penetrating the compound, rebels led by Queen Mary Thomas and her counterparts set fire to the plantations across Frederiksted. They burned homes, torched businesses, and incinerated sugar mills and crops. They encouraged people to seek freedom, blood, and fire. It took 2 weeks for the state to retake control, and in that period of time, the insurgents burned 900 acres, 50 plantations. The Danish retaliated with mighty force by killing over 100 Black laborers, arrested 400 rebels, and sentenced 12 to death instantly. Mary Thomas became the most famous of the three queens due to her militancy, overzealousness, and participation in every riot in St. Croix. She was chosen by the rebels to lead them. Queen Mary, so dedicated to the cause, called for the decapitation of the enslaved who did not want to participate in the revolts. Queen Mary, known for her extreme active participation in vandalism and arson on the plantations, was not offered any mercy when caught. The court sentenced her to death for looting and arson, sending her and the other queens abroad to Christian Haven, Copenhagen. Their sentences were later commuted and they returned to St. Croix. The revolt led to increased pay and better labor conditions, but the contract still heavily benefited the plantation owners. There was still much work to be done. A Danish leaflet documents Mary's jail record in Copenhagen, includes information about her family, that she had 3 children, her health, that at times she had scurvy and fever, and her possessions, which included earrings and a ring. The earrings stood out for me because African mothers tend to pierce children's ears at a very young age. It could be seen as a form of cultural retention and a reclamation of soul. It is also can be seen as a form of resistance. In addition to that, it is noted on her records that she is accused of theft and of child abuse. These charges could have been trumped up. Historically, in the 1870s, Europeans who visited the Caribbean felt that Black women were quite harsh with their children, and so took it upon themselves to teach these Black women how to be better mothers. It was not unheard of that Europeans used the accusation of child abuse against strong Black Caribbean mothers who were courageous enough to stand up against white authority. The Europeans' contradictory behavior is acknowledged. They are critical of Black mothers and their lack of child-rearing skills. Yet these very same white establishments are responsible for the child mortality, famine, disease that ravaged the Danish West Indies, resulting in orphaned Black children. Also, white mothers have notoriously used Black women to nurture their own children, their own white children. Currently, there are monuments dedicated to this pivotal moment. Three Queens Fountain is sculpted in 2005 by Richard Hallier, an American artist. The St. Thomas Historical Trust in the Virgin Islands commissioned the work to memorialize the three women freedom fighters who sacrificed their lives and family to force societal changes in the Danish West Indies. The fountain is erected on a hill above Charlotte-Amalie City in St. Thomas. The placement on the hill allows the local population and tourists to see the monument, even from a fair distance, denotes the importance of these women in the history of the Danish West Indies. Kani Suburi Ayubu, the founder of the Black Art Depot, note that these bronze structures are a symbol of the power and tenacity of these three women who believe in freedom. The three sculptured figures stand back to back to form a triangle, which I might add is the strongest geometrical shape. When force or weight is added to the triangle, it is evenly distributed. This could be a metaphor for their equal commitment to the cause, their mental strength, and ability to bear the burden and cost of representing their fellow Black laborers. They embody bringing liberty to all corners of the land. Their diagonal leaning bodies suggest a charging stance, that they were spearheading the fight. Their lengthy dresses stretched to press against their sturdy body frames suggest dynamic movement and the need to attack with urgency. The figure standing on the right has a flaming torch in her right hand. On the left stands a woman holding a lantern in her left hand. In the center, Queen Mary holds a burning torch in her left hand. Fire is the ultimate weapon of destruction, and a sugarcane knife in the right. In the hands of a slave, a lantern, a torch, and sugarcane knife were lethal tools that could ignite an insurrection. These three powerful figures standing on a stone platform placed in a fountain filled with cascading jets of water suggest that these women emerged from water, refreshed, rejuvenated, and represent a hope for transformed life for the Black laborers. On Saturday, March 31st, 2018, the first public monument to a Black woman, I Am Queen Mary, was erected in Copenhagen outside the Danish West Indian warehouse, currently used as an exhibition space. Two artists, Lavon Bell from the Virgin Islands and Danish artist Jeanette Ellers, collaborate to create the sculpture. Bell reinterprets colonial material artifacts to create new narratives, and Ellers, a video, photo, and performance artist, draws on her Danish and Caribbean ancestry to investigate ethnicity and identity. Her pieces seek to tackle thought-provoking issues, especially Denmark's role as a slave nation, forcing the reinsertion of slavery as part of the Danish cultural heritage and general historiography. Eller says, what's unique about this sculpture is not only its size and thematics, but also that it is not commissioned. It is we, two artists, who are pushing into the public space. The project represents a bridge between the two countries, Bell explains. It's a hybrid of our bodies, nations, and narratives. It extends the conversation beyond the centennial year and gets people to really question what is their relationship to this history. The rebel, Queen Mary Thomas, is an amalgamation of the two artists' bodies through the use of 3D scanning technology. Her imposing, majestic position is seated on a wicker chair, holding a torch and a cane cutter, and is reminiscent of the iconic 1967 photograph of Huey P. Newton, founder of the Black Panther Party, who is also seated on a wicker chair, but holding a rifle and a spear. The torch and cane cutter, occupied in her hands, reveal the weapons of choice used by the enslaved and embattled laborers in resistance. The pedestal that presents Queen Mary incorporates corals cut by enslaved Africans and used for historic buildings that now lay ruined on the island of St. Croix. Queen Mary's bare feet do not take away from her dignity and authority. Although seated, she looks poised for action. She would lunge if provoked. Her stern facial features reveal a resolve, toughness, and resiliency, traits of a fighter. Positioning her to look towards the water reminds Denmark of its active participation in the slave trade. Henrik Holm, senior research curator at the National Gallery of Art in Denmark, states, "It takes a statue like this to make forgetting less easy. It takes a monument like this to fight against the silence, neglect, repression, and hatred. Never before has a sculpture like this been erected on Danish soil." Now, Denmark is offered a sculpture that addresses the past, but it is also an artwork for the future. Today, we are reminded that activists like Queen Mary risk their lives to force change and help people to secure true liberty and have access to better opportunities. In conclusion, Black women have a long enduring legacy of activism and rebellion. Every generation have had Black women involved in an organized movement. Therefore, young Black women of today don't have to look far for inspiration. They stand on the shoulders of their rebellious ancestral sisters. The torch has been carried high and shines brightly as it is passed from one generation to the next. Recently, the murder of Trayvon Martin galvanized the new movement, Black Lives Matter, which is founded and spearheaded by Patrisse Cullors, Alicia Garza, Opal Tometi, who founded Black Lives Matter in the United States, and Sandy Hudson and Janaya Khan founded the Black Lives Matter in Canada. All are women.
Audrey, if you can stop the screen share. Excellent. Thank you so much for that wonderful presentation. So next we're going to have a presentation from Chris J. Gismondi. And then just a reminder, if anyone came in late, we're going to have Rach Klein present. And then at the end, we'll have questions for all three panelists. Thanks.
Just a moment. Okay. So good evening, everyone. Thank you, Dr. Nelson. Thank you to all the organizers, and thank you to everyone for tuning in. Tonight I'll be presenting Temperate Slavery in Upper Canada, Enslaved Women and Founding Families. In the cold air of March 3rd, 1793, William Vrooman of Newark stood on the shore of the Niagara River, binding his enslaved woman, Chloe Cooley, with thick ropes. He violently secured her in the boat and paddled her to be sold across the water to the American buyer in New York State. Chloe, however, refused to go quietly. Screaming and struggling as her means of resistance to a world which operated on laws of white supremacy, patriarchy, the natural enslavement of the fruits from her womb, land theft, and a flourishing imperial trade. Chloe's world of Upper Canada was a relic of the French Empire, an Indigenous territory now filling with Loyalist American refugees and their enslaved property. In Ontario, Canada, and other northern slave-owning sites, we have inherited a benevolent myth that at worst erases slavery, or at best softens its existence as assumedly gentle. Upper Canada was an anomaly for Canadian and temperate slavery, not being directly connected to the sea and the only site in Canada to abolish slavery ahead of 1833 with a gradual abolition in the wake of Chloe's disruption. My presentation today focuses on enslaved women, their actions in difficult situations, and the archival fragments that record just glimpses of their lives. My gendered focus will hopefully become clear when I elaborate on how emancipation was gradual. But the other side of my presentation are the representations of the enslaved and their owners. Throughout the Atlantic world, newspapers were technologies used by the institution of slavery for selling human chattel and pursuing freedom seekers. These archival fragments, glimpses into their lives, record their names and bravery. Unfortunately, these portraits, as Dr. Nelson has theorized them, were unconsensually commissioned by the people who held them in bondage for their recapture and punishment. The slave-owning classes represented themselves conversely in genteel portraits in the high art and European traditions. pale flesh, refinement, and civility almost masking the true nature of their character. There we go. Upper Canada was previously a part of New France, sparsely populated and traversed by the fur trade and military, industries which themselves participated in slavery. Charles was a Panis or indigenous slave who took part in a mutiny at the Niagara garrison in the Pédon-Haute or Upper Country. He was likely enslaved to an officer, and his punishment was living out his life in plantation slavery in Martinique. After the British conquest of 1760, New France's Great Lake interior, including Detroit, was designated the province of Quebec. In 1778, Lieutenant Colonel John Butler, a slave owner and trader, negotiated land from the Mississauga due to overcrowding at Fort Niagara from loyalists fleeing the American Revolution. These American settlers established early towns like Newark or York. Different migrations would settle in the eastern sphere of Lake Ontario at Kingston, Belleville, the Bay of Quinte, and Cornwall. In 1790, the large province was severed into Upper Canada and Lower Canada down the St. Lawrence River. Upper Canada slavery was a unique patchwork of slaving cultures from New France, with its acceptance of both African and Indigenous slavery, plantation masters fleeing the upper south of Virginia, and temperate slave owners coming from New England and New York. What sparked my initial interest in Upper Canada was firstly the absence of current scholarship on the topic, and secondly, the gradual abolition, which was the second in the continent after Pennsylvania's in 1780. Gradual abolition has inaccurately been celebrated. No enslaved were emancipated. Championed by Lieutenant Colonel John Graves Simcoe, slaves owned before 1793 would remain in slavery for life, and any children of enslaved women would have to serve mandatory indentures freed at 25. Northern abolitionist movements were anti-slavery, but pursued freedom not for the enslaved, but for white society to be free from the burden and the presence of Blacks and the specters of their sins. The terminology of disturbing the public peace was evoked in New England and Upper Canada and was intended to restore respectability, not to enfranchise Blacks as citizens into these white spaces. Gradual abolition brought opportunities and dangers for enslaved women, their reproduction, and families of mixed freed and chattel status. Women's reproductive labor and families were implicated in this legislative process of emancipation. So here is a fugitive slave ad for Bet and her 2-year-old son who is fleeing R.L. Evans of Belleville. Gradual abolition means we can interpret this in 2 ways. One, Bet was born after gradual abolition, and she is a minimum of 25 years old, and she's fleeing the end of her indenture or wage servitude. Option 2, however, is more likely. Bet was enslaved for life, and she is fleeing for freedom and sparing her son 25 years of bound labor. R.L. Evans is, of course, trying to apprehend Bet and her son's most productive working years. Gradual abolition's extension into motherhood, family, and this inheritance of enslavement is not unusual to transatlantic slavery. It was deliberately structured along the matrilineal lines, incentivizing breeding or increase and producing more enslavable property. Thus, scholars concur that rape was a ubiquitous practice. Regardless of paternal ancestry, Black motherhood meant enslavability. Now, this is Robert Isaac de Grey, painted by William Birksey, and he owned a Black woman named Dorinda, and she had 2 mulatto or mixed race sons. He was a loyalist, fled the American Revolution from New York, but goes back to purchase Dorinda's mother from another slave owner. Grey holds Dorinda's family in bondage until his death, in his will releasing them from slavery and giving them an inheritance. This is a huge sign that Grey likely had a sexual relationship with his enslaved woman Dorinda, who was legally unable to consent. It was only postmortemly that Grey releases his half-Black family from service to his white family. The exploitation of enslaved women's domestic and sexual labor were often interchangeable, as scholar Hilary Beckles has demonstrated in the Caribbean. The presence of a rental ad for the enslaved woman Chloe, aged 23, owned by Robert Franklin of Newark, may suggest that there was a market for enslaved prostitution. Upper Canada's military transients in the new towns were mirrored to other spaces in the empire with similar practices like Barbados. Even with gradual abolition, the enslaved were held in servitude as late as the 1830s, when British law freed an enslaved couple, Hank and Suki, in Halton County, owned by a Mrs. O'Reilly. Temperate slave owning is routinely belittled in the scope of transatlantic slavery without the horror of plantations driven by cash crops. One example contrary to this is the Irish loyalist Matthew Elliott, who fled Pennsylvania and settles in Amherstburg with about 50 to 60 slaves, recreating a plantation like some maritime loyalists. This artifact, the lashing ring, was spiked into a tree and used for individual corporal punishment and group spectacle to enforce submission. But brilliant scholars of Canadian and Northern slavery have resisted that violence does not end with a small scale. Slavery in the North came with its own unique challenges, like extreme social isolation, a lack of Black community, a hostile white majority population, and a climate which, coupled with strategic material deprivation, was near fatal. The preacher Sojourner Truth, born to a Dutch estate in New York, recalled in her slave narrative that her family lived in the cellar of a hotel with cold, damp, mud floors contributing to their poor health. I draw from Joanne Pope Mellish, who brilliantly pushes against the perception that slave owning in the North was a luxury in the form of servants. She states, quote, "Slaves were crucially important in performing the work that a household head would have performed in a purely subsistence or pre-market economy. The enslaved's non-market labor provided flexibility for professions like government, military, doctors, lawyers, and merchants. Exemplary, a 16-year diary for Minister Joshua Hempstead of Connecticut recorded that 70% of working hours were directed at the market or non-exchange labor, meaning his slave ownership allowed him to divert his efforts from the private sphere to the economy. Thus, slavery helped Northern sites develop to mixed economies and allowed elite and middle-class males and families to divert labor away from their homesteads towards their careers. After staking claim for the important, albeit small, contribution of slavery in the North, there is a sinister control and entitlement rooted in white supremacy. Slave owners in Upper Canada like William Jarvis, or even James McGill in Montreal, used racial slavery to secure labor for themselves. Hannah Jarvis and others in Canadian history identified a servant problem. Indentured servants or hired domestic help had too much social mobility in a setting where new Indigenous lands became available for settlement and encroachment. White working classes routinely took the opportunity to labor for themselves. I thus theorize that apprehending runaways, selling or purchasing the enslaved in Canada was a crucial point of control rooted in white supremacy. Slave owners held Black and Indigenous people against their will, controlling their livelihoods and labor as a solution to the servant problem of upwardly mobile, white, working, and indentured classes. Indigenous servitude in English colonies like New England, South Carolina, and the Caribbean were practiced at times of conquest and war. Practices of Indigenous slavery in Canada are well documented by historians of slavery in New France and Quebec under both the French and the British. And even Afro-Indigenous slaves are well documented in fugitive ads from spaces like New York and Pennsylvania. In Upper Canada, it would appear some Indigenous slaves remained, like this fugitive ad for Sal from the Niagara Herald. The other side of this coin is the presence of Indigenous nations participating in slave raids and the trading of Black chattel, particularly during the American Revolutionary Wars. Nations allied with England were documented attacking Patriot properties and bringing back African slaves as spoils of war, distributing them amongst themselves and British military. Sophia Pooley, in 1851 at the age of 90, recorded her testimony of being kidnapped from New York and her enslaved family, brought into Canada by white traders and sold to Joseph Brant. She describes the Mohawk leader's wife as barbarous and violent. She recalls Brant owned 2 other Black men and remembers one other Indigenous slave owner. Despite Brant advocating for her adoption and humane treatment, he sold her to an English immigrant at Ancaster. Historian Tia Miles is guiding me through my thinking here that Native America is a, quote, significant location of the Black diaspora that many slavery studies overlook. She concludes that Indigenous leaders and mixed Euro-Indian descendants adopted private property and anti-Black racism in the form of chattel as a tool of legitimacy and power. In the middle ground of Upper Canada, as a remaining ember of the British colonies, wedged between New France and the rebellious American states, Indigenous nations adopted their war captive traditions and participated in raids, grasped for power, and adopted the practices of their allies. Shifting back from Afro-Indigenous relations to the Black-white binary, I present the Jarvises, another ruling loyalist government family. They flee Connecticut, are stationed in London, and reappear as slave owners in Upper Canada. A big question for me in this is if they took their chattel with them. And the historian of British slavery, F.O. Shylon, shows that despite the Somerset decision of 1772, the practice was common. In Newark and York, they own about 6 or 7 enslaved people, and the Jarvis home at Sherburne and Adelaide had slave quarters to house their servants. Hannah Jarvis, in a letter, recorded her misunderstood anger at the gradual abolition, that Simcoe, quote, has by a piece of chicanery freed all the Negroes. This was, of course, not true. In 1801, their enslaved woman Kitty is committed to the York jail for punishment, allegedly assaulting William. Jarvis himself presides over the charges when she pleads guilty. William withdraws the charges, hoping she would return to service without the usual punishment of whipping. Kitty then remarkably decides to remain in jail, continuing her winter incarceration. Historian Natasha Henry remarks, quote, Kitty preferred prison over the residence of the Jarvises. In these European-style portraits, Angela Rosenthal's work on reading whiteness and aristocracy is guiding the lens of how I read these. Many of James Earle's London portraits have been misattributed to artists like Joshua Reynolds, William Beechey, or his teacher, Benjamin West. Earle was praised for, quote, his ability to show nuances of age by flesh tones used in the face, and yet flatter an older woman is particularly noticeable. Similarly, Swiss critic Andrew Rocco also praised English painters for their use of color and subtle mastery of tonal variations, particularly in women's complexions. Signaling the white, fair complexion, Angela Rosenthal theorized, quote, whiteness as a visually racial category emerged as an explicit value in the 18th century. Portraiture became a prominent visual indicator of feminine virtue, vitality, and purity in a fair woman's involuntary act of blushing. Whiteness in the transatlantic colonies would emerge atop a hierarchy of anti-Indigenous and anti-Black racism. The purity of white women was policed to make the genteel citizens and inheritors of the colonial wealth. In a world where Black blood was traced for its enslavability and Indigenous nations were believed to be vanishing under the empire, this social, political, and economic context provides many interjections into critical whiteness in Canadian art history that have yet to be examined. The last introduction I want to make is to Peggy, who is by far the most rebellious woman I've encountered in my research so far. She fled the Irish Upper Canadian Peter Russell and avoided recapture, prompting a reprinting of the Runaway ad. Russell was the second administrator of Upper Canada from 1796 to 99, when the capital was moved from Newark to York. He negotiated land dispossession treaties with the Anishinabeg and owned Peggy along with her children Jupiter, Millie, and Amy, whose father was a free man named Pompadour. 3 years after her flight, he advertises to sell Peggy and Jupiter, potentially separating them from one another, as well as Peggy's other 2 children. Russell highlights to buyers, quote, that they are each of them servants for life, euphemistically concealing that they are legally enslaved despite the gradual abolition. Another key scholar for slavery studies and the reading of fragments of Black slavery in the archive is Marissa Fuentes. When we encounter Peggy in the archive, her rebellion to servitude is clouded by language of criminality and the persistent emphasis on her chattel ownership. So I encourage us to think and speculate how Peggy would represent herself or want us to remember her and the other women across this research. Fabricated into identities of racially Black and legally enslaved, I believe we also have to uncover their existence as loving mothers, tenacious partners, and incredibly brave, robust people navigating a dark world. After Simcoe's departure, Russell and other members of the slave-owning government majority, like Richard Cartwright, James Bobby, and Christopher Robinson, proposed legislation to reintroduce slavery by legalizing the importation of slaves into the province. Their efforts would narrowly fail. Anti-slavery had to be maintained against a political order that increasingly would rationalize itself with racial pseudoscience. In the coming decades, the region would see another war, further Indigenous land dispossession, and eventually the refuge of free African Americans, the story Canadians are far too familiar with. To the women I have highlighted today, I propose we celebrate their ability to grasp control from slave owners at every opportunity, wherever we can find it in the archive. And if we cannot find it, we must work to fill in those gaps. Thank you.
Thank you, Christopher, for a wonderful presentation. We'll now go to the last of the three presentations from Rach Klein, and then we'll open for questions and conversations.
Okay, hi everyone. I hope folks can see this okay up on the screen. It's so great to be here and sharing research with you all. I lived in Halifax for a number of years, and it's great to be back even virtually at the Anna. The research that I'm going to be sharing with you today focuses on the life and work of Dave Drake, an enslaved artisan and master potter working in the Edgefield region of South Carolina in the early to mid 19th century. His creations, as I hope you'll come to see in this presentation, are remarkable, and I felt very grateful to be doing the work of learning from and alongside him. I'm going to use a lot of slides and images throughout this presentation, in part because I just really miss looking at art with other people, and it's nice to have the chance to do that here together, and in part because Dave Drake was prolific. He created hundreds of vessels in his lifetime and signed many of them. Despite racist and active literacy laws in South Carolina, he has an extraordinary oeuvre of identified work. Some of it has poetry engraved on it, and some which just bears a signature or date. And although certainly within this presentation, I don't have the time to even cover a fragment of his body of work, I do want to try and share a number of his pieces, because every single one that he chose to write on is its own extraordinary act of both resilience and artistry. So while my presentation is only going to focus on a few of his pieces and their poems, the images on the screen are going to reflect a wider array of Dave's work. To introduce Dave, I first have to try and construct the circumstances under which he was creating. So between 1820 and 1890, the Edgefield region of South Carolina, known informally as Pottersville or Ladrumsville, as you can see on the map on the screen, produced thousands of earthenware pots, jugs, and tankards that ranged in size from a few ounces to up to 40 gallons. These were largely created for use on plantations across the southern states for food preservation and storage. At the helm of the ceramic epicenter was the Ladrum family, who were Scottish descendant and white, and who established a number of pottery factories that relied on kinship networks, on marriages within powerful settler families, and most importantly, relied on slave labor. Although there were several other pottery factories that were held by families in Edgefield, the Ladrums and their merging with the subsequent wealthy Miles family have a large legacy in the history of American ceramics, and indeed within the history of American slavery. A key figure in these intertwining legacies is Dave Drake. Local newspapers in the early 19th century, such as the Edgefield Hive and Edgefield Advertiser, list enslaved artisans with skills in pottery production for sale. As Dr. Nelson and Chris have both astutely pointed out in their own work, in studies of transatlantic slavery, these advertisements of sales often become ways of reconstructing memory, and for myself as an art historian, of creating visual reconstructions of who these people might be, despite being listed among cattle or mules or objects, and again, as Chris pointed to, being referred to as chattel, these lists of sale represent personhood. And so we have to continue to remind ourselves to look among these ads for that personhood. In Edgefield, the low-key of my research, it's also imperative to note that the patriarch of the Ladrum family also owned and operated the Edgefield Hive Advertiser, which you see on the right-hand side of the screen. Operating the newspaper gave him a lot of access to picking and choosing and selling enslaved Black artisans, as we can imagine. And he also likely made use of enslaved labor in the newspaper production site as well as the pottery site. And it's been speculated by many scholars of Dave Drake that it was in the context of typesetting that he may have gained literacy. So although in Pottersville, advertisements such as this list put turner as the most common slave occupation, as in one who turns vessels on a wheel, the turner, Cindy K. Baldwin, a scholar of Drake who's written extensively on his work, has rightly argued that slaves were undoubtedly involved in every aspect of stonework production, from digging, hauling, and preparing the clay to turning and firing the wares and wagoning it to market. The clay had to be gathered from riverbeds before being mixed with sand and water using a pug mill. And although with a pug mill, animals would be carrying the brunt of the weight, walking around a central axis in order to mix the clay, there would undoubtedly be laborers overseeing them and checking on the mixtures, among their many other tasks. After the clay was gathered and mixed and left to set, it could be cut into different sized pieces and then transported to the turners, who would then transform the mess of wet clay into vessels. So when they say turners, it encompassed a lot of other work. And bear in mind that all this labor I've just mentioned has happened even before the dangerous, hot, and difficult work of loading and firing the kilns, not to mention transporting vessels to market for sale. Among the turners, and again, I want to highlight this word, this turners encompassing quite a lot more than turning. But among the turners listed as owned by the Ladram family was Dave Drake, who's generally referred to in scholarship, censuses, and historical archives as simply Dave, or Dave the Potter. The most documented of Dave's pieces are, unsurprisingly, the ones onto which he engraved poetic couplets that range in theme from the romantic to the religious. To the modern viewer, these writings create dynamic works of art that seem to transcend the utilitarian food storage purpose for which they were initially made. To various scholars of transatlantic slavery, accustomed to parsing out the words of white slave owners in search of the identities and experiences of the enslaved, Dave's literacy presents a rare and precious opportunity to learn about life for him through his own words and, importantly, in his own handwriting. Dave's writing reveals how his creations were bought, sold, and used, and it also provides clues as to how the same was done to him. His words offer glimpses into what occupied his mind as he turned endless clay and sweated over the scorching kilns of Pottersville, and they indicate how he communicated with the world. And here I will cite Michael Chaney, who in the introduction to a recent anthology, Where Is All My Relation, on Dave Drake's work, writes, repeated on one jar after another, the name swells nearly to an imperative, Dave. In the descriptions above, Dave is an exclamation of identity, personhood interjected. Dave is also a maker and a lyric speaker. He is a busy eye who sees, shoots, sees more, feels, and belongs. Found in private collections within museums and excavated in broken shards, Dave's slanting cursive etched his signature in confident loops, forming a traceable lifetime of labor. The four letters, D, A, V, E, occasionally appear alone on a vessel, standing out in stark contrast to otherwise unmarked clay pots, and sometimes it appears alongside a date, 1848, 1832, 1850, denoting the many years of enslavement and production that he lived through. And here at some of Dave's written signatures and looking at his handwriting together, I want to take a pause for us to think about the power and affect that this particular signature, these four letters, have, and how we as viewers in this strange 2021 are actually looking at something together that's pretty extraordinary and that's worth pausing over. Signatures hold power, particularly in the post-colonial world, with the prioritization of contracts and Euro-dominant creation of rigorous borders, citizenship, and identity papers of various hierarchies. Signatures are tools of oppression, and they've also been historical tools of collective organization and liberation. Signatures give an ability to briefly self-describe, to forge a trackable identity. Signatures are witnesses that can attest to presence, to the written remnants of an individual. When I look at the swooping letters of Dave's name, I cannot help but remember Sojourner Truth, being illiterate but carrying a signature book, and working and learning to produce her signature, which we see on the screen here, because of the intense weight that it has within the colonial world to allow you to try and navigate systems that weren't necessarily built for you and certainly were not built for her. And I also remember that despite collecting thousands of signatures in the late 1860s to petition the government to provide former slaves with land, Congress never took action. So all that to say is I take the significance of signatures and of Dave's signatures pretty seriously as a scholar. And this is also a good way to tell you briefly about the decision to refer to Dave by his first name in my own research. Along with recognizing that signatures have power, so too do names. After the Civil War in 1865, it appears that Dave Drake took the last name Drake, which was likely in reference to one of his first owners in Edgefield, Harvey Drake. In the 1870s USA Census, therefore, he is listed as David Drake Turner. But he signed his work Dave, not Drake, not David. And as he is the authority on his own name, I decided to use the name that he wrote, that he engraved. Although some of the textual sources that I use refer to him with other nominal variations. Similarly to names, finding the I within enslaved people's labor is intentionally suppressed. By this, I mean that the individuality of the enslaved was carefully stripped away, dehumanizing them while simultaneously trying to scrub evidence of their forced labor from its results, the production of cotton, tobacco, steel, and pottery, to name a few, for example. In the work of artisans such as Dave, this suppression and lack of accreditation acts as its own form of creative disorder. It manifests objects that are estranged from makers, art with unidentifiable artists. For objects, materials, and structures made by enslaved workers, the notion of authorship therefore becomes a particularly vexed web. Wherever a creation can be attributed to an enslaved artisan, so too can we find remnants of the overseeing presence of their white owners. And several of Dave's vessels really grapple with these complexities, and I want to share them with you here. So first up on the screen is a piece dated July 31st, 1840 on one side of the rim of the vessel. I use the word side, but that's not quite right. As we can imagine, these are read in the round. But on the other side, if we can call it that, of the vessel are the following lines, and this is perhaps your first introduction to Dave's poetry. When he writes, Dave belongs to Mr. Miles, where the oven bakes and the pot biles. This is engraved beneath the lip and stretching horizontally towards the two embedded handles of this large alkaline glaze jug you can see up here. This is a placement that's quite typical of Dave's signatures, and it's interesting to think about how that affects how you might have carried it if the handles sort of cradle the signature. In this case, this text, this couplet, denotes ownership and location while also positioning the self, Dave, as a tool of production. Not only does he belong to Miles in his own words, but he also belongs specifically to the pottery mill where the oven bakes. Here, the vessel onto which Dave is writing conceptually collapses with the person who made it. Both Dave and the jug can be bought and sold, are owned by others, and exist exclusively in relation to where the pot biles. These questions of power and creation and relation bubble up pretty readily here. Did Lewis Miles, the Mr. Miles to which Dave is referring, who owned Drake for a number of years, also own the jug onto which this was engraved? Or did it pass hands, as Dave later would, sold to the highest bidder? The materiality at work in this piece includes not only the earthenware vessel itself and the gentle ridges of text, but also the body of Dave as he documents his positionality in the clay. This idea of positionality in the clay and the body itself leads me into another facet of my research on Dave and Edgefield earthenware, which is continuing to research and offer ideas about the relationship between the mostly male workers who created the earthenware vessels in Edgefield and the mostly female domestic workers who had eventually filled them with preserves on southern plantations. Like the medium of pottery itself, food storage involves a physical closeness between the creator and the material. And here I have an image of one of Drake's most recently uncovered or located works. I will not use the word discovered here intentionally, which is a butter churn dated 1858. On it is written, "This is a noble churn, fill it up, it will never turn." And here I want to quote Cheney again, who says, "Being filled is a vessel's self-actualization." Pottery, like churning butter, butchering, cooking, and curing meat, requires people to deeply embed their hands in the material, to press against all sides of the vessel's body, and to leave a small piece of the self in whatever you're making, a drop of sweat, for example, a fingerprint, or a smudge. And while the permanence of earthenware obviously differs from the impermanence of food, they nonetheless exist in kinship to each other, as a vessel is created to be filled and food cannot be prepared without being held. Being filled is a vessel's self-actualization. Therefore, in order for contemporary scholars to consider Dave's beautifully engraved jars, jugs, and vessels as materials of significant history, the absence of the consumables with which they were filled must be included. And here, I just want to share this because this was such a joy to find in my own research. This is some excerpts from What Mrs. Fisher Knows About Southern Cooking, which is the first cookbook written by someone who was born into slavery, Mrs. Abby Fisher. And it's filled with recipes from Southern plantations that she had made. It's a real gem of a text that is available in public domain, so I'm just letting everyone know about it. But I digress. What I'm working towards saying is that the labor of enslaved workers involved in the life cycles of Dave's creation extended into many facets and touched many hands, including those who filled the vessels. Enslaved labor was also used to transport vessels from pottery site to market and down riverways and eventually into kitchens and so on. The mobility of earthenware here as a 360-degree object necessitates what art historian Alex Potts calls a kinesthetic viewing, a term which he applied to sculpture, but we can so readily apply to these as they are also sculptures. Potts writes that taking in sculpture is manifestly not just a matter of looking and scanning, but also of taking the time to walk around it. With Drake's work, we can think about taking the time to lift it, to touch it. And here on the screen, unfortunately, I don't have an image of this particular vessel. They haven't all been digitized, but luckily we do have excerpts of the poetry. And this was from April 12th, 1858, when Dave engraved a very large jar, which has 4 handles, packet full of fresh meat, then light candles. So here, the first half of the couplet refers to a vessel's exterior structure. It tells us that this is a large jar with 4 handles. It's a process, it's a visual description. While the second half of the phrase of the couplet refers to filling the vessel with food. Yet both of these parts of the text make a direct reference to the reader's action. A very large jar with 4 handles is instructive as much as it is reflective. 4 handles implies the possibility of 4 hands, meaning that this vessel could have been carried by at least 2 workers, engaging in this intertwined dance as they moved from kiln to marketplace to kitchen. And it's these kind of intricacies, the many hands that touch these vessels, that I'm really interested in my work. So finally, I want to end by talking about the last jar that has been ascribed, excuse me. I want to end by talking about one of the earliest engraved vessels attributed to Dave, which has just a single word on it. Again, I don't have an image of it, but I'm going to speak about it. And I've put this one up on the screen so we can maybe think about the process of engraving. So on June 12th, 1834, Dave wrote one word, concatenation, concatenation. Now, concatenation refers to the linking of things or a series of interconnected events or objects. Arthur Goldberg, a prominent scholar on Dave Drake, has suggested that this was written in reference to the chains or bonds of slavery. But to be frank, I find that reading reductive. The interconnected web that Dave lived included links to other people, communities, and creations. It included the powerful influences of both his white owners and fellow enslaved workers, and an intimate understanding of the many interdependent stages of pottery production. There are a myriad of connections that Dave could have referred to beyond the image of change that have since come to represent slavery so dominantly. Instead, I offer that concatenation, engraved in the same slanting handwriting that distinguishes all of Dave's text, is a single word that embodies much of what the pottery of Edgefield can teach us. Concatenation speaks to the syncretism of Edgefield. The word is material, with looping O's, cross T's, and the high arches of A's that you can imagine being gently traced with your finger. The word is theoretical, with philosophical implications in Latin etymology, con meaning with or together, and catena meaning chain. It is a series of things united, a series of things that depend on each other to create a whole, and links with indeterminate beginnings and ends. The word is both sophisticated and, in Dave's handwriting, misspelled. It is written on a vessel that was produced by an African descendant person born into slavery around 1800 on Native American land and owned for his lifetime by Scottish descendants. It is engraved on the same kind of alkaline glaze that has been found in ancient objects in the Middle East and Asia, and on an object that's fired in a kiln whose projection has links in ancient Chinese ceramics, as Edgefield earthenware was fired using dragon kilns. The vessel itself may have stored meat that people from varying regions relied on throughout long years working on plantations. Concatenation, therefore, is an unexpected summation of the work of Dave Drake, and it carries in its 13 letters an extraordinary history of Edgefield and a pretty remarkable lifetime to have documented slowly, letter by letter, in clay. I'll end here.
Thank you very much. If we can have Audrey and Chris and Rach join us again by video as well, and we can start to take some questions from the audience. And please know that there's no question too basic or simple, because we all understand as scholars working in the field of transatlantic slavery studies and Canadian slavery that in our nation, especially in Canada, there is not a lot of opportunity to learn about these histories in grade school, in high school, in college or university. So we welcome all types of questions and conversation from you. So Dorico, I know, is going to help me by showing me what questions we're getting, but maybe I'll start with one. It strikes me too, I'll just point out the obvious, that all three of you are talking about different forms of enslaved resistance across 3 different regions, 2 sites that are tropical or semi-tropical, usually aligned with plantation slavery, although Rach, you're bringing in this issue of a completely out of the box type of production that people do not typically associate with enslaved labor, like ceramics. And then Chris, you're talking about, of course, a temperate climate, what we call slave minority site, where the enslaved became a minority of the population. Maybe I'll just begin with Audrey and Chris here. So in your work, you're both dealing with enslaved females. I'm wondering if you could talk briefly, each of you, about what you're learning and what you can tell us about enslaved female resistance, practices of family, and practices of motherhood across your 2 sites. So Audrey dealing with the Danish West Indies, and Chris, what are you figuring out is happening in Upper Canada, which becomes Ontario? So whoever would like to begin, that's great.
I guess for me, it's interesting from sort of in conversations that you and I have had, but in other spaces where there is such a slave minority population in these temperate and northern sites, but it is still remarkable to me that they find each other. And I don't know how it is, but I think that's even remarkable too, whether you're Montreal or Quebec or Niagara in a tent outside of a military fort because you're just had to flee the American Revolution. Somehow Black families find each other and they make partnerships and they decide to still love and marry despite everything that they're going through and what that means for them and their children. And so I think just that they make those bonds, and some people, sometimes maybe those bonds have been made or they haven't been made and it's hard to find in the archive. But then when they are made, and how you preserve them or how you protect your family. But even the fact that, to me, just that you would go through the lengths to make that family is something really sort of extraordinary.
Absolutely. And Audrey, what about you? What are you discovering that you can share with us about the Danish West Indies?
Well, what I'm finding out is the lens that especially these women went to protect themselves and to protect their children. Even things that we wouldn't look at in terms of protecting them It's that they would go to extreme lengths, even killing them, because they do not want them to be slaves. And you think about the extreme measures that these women, and the trauma, the psychological trauma, that is always something that I've focused on and tried to basically empathize in the sense of the acts that these women had to go through, the rapes, the constant abuse, because you don't know when it's coming. So how do you plan for this? So you're in a constant state of angst, and how this can be translated into like how you raise your children, how do you raise your daughters, and so forth. So those are the type of questions that I've been trying to imagine these women's daily existence, yet they did find the time to care for their children and to nurture, and even in terms of dress, even in dressing their families and so forth, even though they're constantly faced with the brutality of being enslaved.
So Audrey, if I stay with you for a second here, you made a point of saying that when you talked to us about one of the Queen Mary, I believe, that she was maligned in the archive, her mothering specifically, right? That she had perhaps brutalized her children, or she was a bad mother. And we see that in different locations of the transatlantic world, of course. But I'm wondering, have you detected a distinction between the way that slave motherhood was characterized in the period of slavery compared to free Black women? Because we note here that the revolt you're talking about takes place in what, 1870s or 1880s?
1878.
Right, so decades after the end of slavery, but still close to that period. So is there a shift in how motherhood or Black motherhood is depicted in slavery as opposed to coming out of slavery in the Danish West Indies? Or is it just still the stereotyping of the bad Black mother?
I think because when I look at Mary Thomas, she was free, right?
Okay.
So despite her freedom, she was accused of these. So I think that although they were quote unquote free, a lot of the sentiments, a lot of the ideas around Black mothering or motherhood would have remained the same for a very long time, where they malign Black women, but by saying that we're abusers. Yet on the other hand, they use us to nurture their own children, and we have to put down our own children to go and take care of white children. So that is not being considered as well, because if I have to breastfeed a white child, well, what do I give my child? So those are the type of things that I look at in terms of, so when the accusations are there, you have to think is, well, what is behind the accusation, and how is the accusation unfair and caused by them in the first place?
Excellent. And now a question for Rach, and I'll go to an audience question. So for Rach, I was really curious to know, what is your theory on why the Landrums, I believe you said the slave owning family who owned Dave, that was their name, why would they have allowed him to inscribe the pots? Because of course we know across the transatlantic world, literacy for an enslaved was deemed to be absolutely dangerous. Most slave owners absolutely wanted, that's the last thing they wanted, a literate enslaved person, because knowledge was power. So here we have Dave, you alluded to the fact he may have become literate in the context of a printing shop, but why allow him to inscribe the pots? Because of course they would have had control over whether or not to allow him to sign his name, to inscribe the pots in any way, shape, or form. So do you have a theory on that, Rach?
Yeah, that's such a great question, because it is a little bit mysterious to sort of realize not only was this person literate, but they were writing in abundance and writing in ways that were traveling. And there's a few different theories as to how this sort of got away with it. If we want to say that, there's this phrase that Edward Glissant uses, which talks about risky everyday retorts. And I really like that, and thinking about every single phrase that was sent out was a risky retort. One of the theories is that the Ladrum, Abner Ladrum, was a preacher, and he really believed that reading the Bible and literacy was a key to with saviorism for his slaves, for the folks who were enslaved in his area. And because he's written about that a little bit in his diaries and talked about sort of promoting literacy in the context of his own controllable slave population, that does hint that maybe they were amused by Drake's writing. A lot of Drake's writing is religious. So that could have had an allowance. There is a 10-year period where he doesn't have any vessels that have been attributed to him, and he was sold during that period. So we wonder here is maybe that owner for that period did say, no, you're not going to do this. And these gaps make me wonder about when he was able to make these reports and when he wasn't, or what he wrote that was hidden. We have to assume we're seeing something pretty selective.
Thank you so much. Now, question for any or all of you from the audience. I loved that the three of you used such a range of sources, including art, to discuss these complex histories and deeply honor the lives and the stories of the enslaved people you spoke about. Can you speak a bit more about what art historical analysis offers to the study of histories of slavery? So that's a good one for three art historians. And obviously, Dr. Nelson is a leader in this area, but I would love to hear what the three panelists have to say. I would too. So which of you or all of you wants to tackle that? Chris, go for it. How about you start us off, Chris?
Sure. I mean, for me, it's really interesting. I always feel like when I'm with historians, I'm the only art historian in the room, or when I'm with art historians, I'm sort of like too much of a historian. So in that sense, I feel like, with the exception of the portrait of a Haitian woman, formerly portrait of a Negro slave, like art objects in Canada about Black subjects are so rare. That for me, I think sort of the place to go to is whiteness in portraiture, and that's something that European scholars, and I think American and us in sort of different parts of the New Worlds, are starting to get into. But I think just because like race developed as this physical distinction, I think art history is sort of the most obvious place where we should sort of pick up this racial analysis in slavery studies. Yeah, and so for me, like, I haven't found a portrait or a representation of an enslaved or free Black person from Upper Canada, but there's this wealth of military and government white portraiture, which definitely can sort of be spoken to in everything that has to communicate.
Thanks. And Rach and Audrey, what do you think about that question? What is art history bringing to the table?
Well, personally, I believe that imagery, in whichever form or format, helps to ground history in terms of, well, when you can, sometimes you can, how should I say, you read something, and although the words itself are very powerful, sometimes the imagery that matches the words, like especially when we're looking at transatlantic slavery or so forth, things that are potentially like inward, they're very potent. But I think art can be used as a vehicle to cement those words and make it very real. Because if we also have to remember that when these artists are either commissioned or of their own volition make these portraits, so like the slaves that are thrown overboard or committing suicide or of whippings and so forth, that these things are happening and they're real. They're not imaginative. It's not like a cute little story or anything like that. It is real. They're real things that are happening to us, a group of people, that leads to things like being traumatized. So I always draw on the visual to feed or to cement the words.
Excellent. And Rach, do you have something to say on that question too? I'm sure you do.
That was such a great answer that Audrey gave there. I think that there is something to be said for the affect that art has that is so unparalleled. And I'm sure that everybody watching here for this particular event has known that and felt that. I also think inversely, we can ask this question: what does art history as an area of studies gain from this research on transatlantic slavery? And I think that's equally as important a question, because the genre of art history gains a lot when we start to expand our definitions of what is and isn't art, and what visual material is worthy of study. And so it's double weight. I feel like we get a lot with our theory, we get a lot as historians, and it works in these dual directional ways. So.
Excellent. Thank you all three. Another question for all of you. All three presentations were very compelling and well-researched. Are plans being made to publish this work? I'm grateful to you all for moderating, hosting, and presenting the event. So publications next. Okay, who's up for that? Who wants to share publication plans?
I can go ahead. I'm gratefully being published in Dr. Nelson's upcoming anthology on creolization and visual remnants of slavery with Routledge, and some of my work on Dave Drake will be featured in that.
Excellent. And Chris and Audrey, any plans? And just to note that they're all also working on dissertations, or working towards dissertations or theses as well.
Well, as you know, Professor Nelson, I gave this a similar presentation in your class. And one of the key things that, as going over the presentation again, there's so much to research about this woman, Queen Mary, because she wasn't from St. Croix. She was from Antigua. And so if you try to go back, and you're trying to trace things, as I'm going back, I'm looking and I'm seeing that, they were having riots as well. So you're wondering if she was also a part of the riots there, and Antigua being owned by the Brits, if they were, if she were sold, to get rid of her to St. Croix, to the Danish. So there's so much to unearth about her and her lives and so on, that at this point in time, I don't know, but it would be something that I would love to address, because it's like so many questions and the curiosity is there. So hopefully in a little bit in the future, I can turn my attention to this.
And Chris, what about you? Any publication?
Yeah, I'm in, for anyone who doesn't know me, I'm doing my comps this year. So hopefully once the dissertation is done, I would love to sort of get the information out there. But if anyone is interested, I will say that Dr. Nelson and I helped edit a bunch of 4 publications this past summer from her last class at McGill, which all sort of have topics about slavery in Canada. So there's a tour. What did we do? There's a tour, there's a journal of Canadian fugitive slave ads, McGill's recommendations and report, and a virtual exhibition on bills of sale. So all of those are really great resources that exist now.
Chris did double time. Chris was a student in the class and the RA for the class. So Chris wrote wonderful introductions for a bicentenary report from McGill University, which is, McGill's having its 200th anniversary, and James McGill was a slave owner. So we wrote a 97-page report for that. And yeah, as Chris articulated, also comparative fugitive slave ad analysis and a slavery tour of Montreal. And I think we're missing some credit. We analyzed bills of sale for the province of Quebec as well. I'll put right now in the chat my website, so you could go there and see all the, and Chris, by the way, I have also an open access undergrad student journal, and Chris was my undergrad student. I'm no dummy. I spotted Chris years ago and I said, Chris, go away and do your MA and come back and do your PhD with me. So Chris was originally my PhD student at McGill, and because I wanted more time with Chris. So I published, I think, 2, Chris, of your journal articles back when you were an undergrad student, so they can also find those online. So thank you all for those answers there. Okay, another question here. Let's see here. All right, so one person wants to just let Chris know. Okay, first of all the presentations were illuminating, interesting. I have a rare example of a portrait of a powerful free Black woman in Atlantic Canada for Chris and for the other panelists, and that's Rose Fortune from the 1830s in the town of Annapolis Royal. And Chris, I have a digitized version of that I can share with everybody. So I'll make sure you get a hold of that. Also here, let's see. Thank you all for your presentations. A question for Rach, though, perhaps, or the three of you. It's interesting that craft or industry is a place where we find the creative material cultures of enslaved people. I wonder if you could offer your thoughts on where we see stories or traces about the creative expressions of enslaved people. And again, that could be for all of you. So who would like to tackle that one? Maybe Rach, you want to start first because they brought up craft and industry?
Yeah, I can start. What a great question again. So to this question, if you could offer your thoughts on where we see stories / traces about the creative expressions of enslaved people, I can sort of speak to how I stumbled upon Dave Drake, which was actually looking at graveside materials in South Carolina. I was interested in broken crockware and pottery and pieces and remnants that were being left at graves in significant ritualized and spiritual ways. And there's this wonderful line in Faulkner's Go Down Moses, where he talks about on the Black grave, there are things that we as white folks cannot respond to. They represent something that it's not just broken, it's not just litter. And then therefore, what is it? And so that's what led me into finding broken pieces of Drake's work. And so this valuation of traces of fragments, I think, is really a point of entry when we assume that materials of significance come only out of arts industry. We're so limited. Instead of working back, what are these remnants I'm interested in, and where are there fragments? In this case, it was, what is this garbage on a grave and why does it matter? And then finding out it's not garbage, and here's why, and here's all this history. And so that entry point has really been a way of recollecting, as you say, these traces. And I think that's a really apropos word here.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And Chris, you showed us a fragment of an implement of corporal punishment or torture from the slave owner. Are you coming across, the cultural expression, material production of the enslaved in your research in Upper Canada as well? Have you been able to find any objects in collections or private homes?
So not yet, but I would absolutely love to. And of course, like Rach, when we think about the variety of tasks that enslaved people had, of course, someone somewhere would have made implements, or we know that people were cabinet makers making furniture. Like, cultural artifacts that enslaved people produced definitely exist in Canada. It's whether or not they're cataloged in the archive and whether or not someone can sort of dig them up. But just to sort of speak about other places where we find it, I feel like it sort of comes from necessity, but also comes from sort of expectations in their labor. So similar to, I'm so happy that Rach brought in a cookbook, because at home in Ontario, I have a copy of Hannah Jarvis's cookbook. And it's so fascinating to flip through it to me and think, what did she have her enslaved women cook? Like, to think that they were sort of making the same recipes, and to think that cooking might not be sort of high art as we take it, but to think of it as some form of expression and place of creative agency. As well, something that I think you and I have talked about is like dressmaking and tailoring, and the enslaved were washing and mending and hemming clothing and their owner's clothing, as well as likely making it for themselves. And then about the part of necessity, I know that in the American South, there was a tradition of sort of quilt making because you didn't have enough and you got cold at night. So this sort of really brilliance and this creativity when you need to because it's expected of you, but also when you have to and you find a creative solution for the problems that you find yourself in under a system like transatlantic slavery.
Thank you. And Audrey, to you, is there anything that you're stumbling upon that's unique, you think, to the Danish West Indies or a more tropical experience in terms of production?
Well, in the tropic, I look at clothing especially, and one of the key things, like I was mentioning about Mary Thomas, is that her ears were pierced. I found that so, like, I latched onto that because as daughters, we always get the first thing you get, first jewelry you get are earrings. The other thing that I look at is that despite the hardship that a lot of these women, like in Jamaica, I know they they were asking the indigenous population how to dye clothing, how to dye materials, how to make lace, and so forth. So they were on a mission to retain their culture and also to learn how to use what was available to them to basically, what they would say, nice up their clothes. So they would want the pretty colors and so forth, because they want to go go to church or to Sunday market looking good. And it was a source of pride for them to be able to dress their families. So when you think about what they're doing during the course of the everyday, but yet they found the time to learn these things, to learn how to use the indigenous or the materials around them to make, you know, beautiful colors and so forth. It was a way for them to hold on to what semblance of self they had, and to say, you know what, you have everything of me, but like the spirit and my spirit, my soul, my culture, you cannot take. So that is what I will practice. So I look at it as that. I was thinking as Chris was talking about the quilts in Gismondi, you know, how they created their own museum-like thing where they would do their quilts, then they would make their quilts from whatever remnants of materials that they had, and then they would put them on clotheslines. And literally one day you just walk by and you can see everybody exhibiting what they've made, right? Isn't that a museum? You know, it may be outside, but it's still a museum, right?
Mhm. Thank you all for that. Those are brilliant, brilliant responses. I just want to just read a comment here. Someone is commenting that in parts of Upper Canada at the end of the 18th century, they believe that there were 15 to 20% of the population was enslaved. And in parts of the Hudson Valley, where Sojourner Truth and Sophia Birth and Pooley were born, we see over 20% of the population enslaved. This does not seem small and exacerbates the isolation of the individuals. So I think, yeah, there's much research to be done there too. As Chris alluded to, Matthew Elliott is a planter who tries to reconstruct that slave majority plantation in Upper Canada. And typically we don't think of that as a part of Canadian slavery, do we? We think of the slave household that has one or two enslaved people at a time. I just wanted to say too here, you're also brilliant. I'm so thankful that you agreed to participate in this, but it is 7 o'clock. So as 7 o'clock over here in Halifax. So as we wrap up here, I wanted to say that the brilliance of your responses too about the traces of the bodies of the enslaved too, you know, we see it in all of your brilliant work. So for Audrey, you're talking us through the orality, the written, and the visual representations of these three, you know, female leaders of this revolt, right? So you end with the, of course, in center for us, the visual representations that are contemporary. And then of course, Chris is powerfully talking about traces of resistance that have been registered, unfortunately, by the slave owners as fugitive or runaway slave ads in newspapers in Upper Canada. And then for Rach, of course, you bring us to the actual body and hand of Dave and the other enslaved people who had to manipulate, create the clay pots and the actual signature of Dave. And I just want to end by throwing out a revelation to me today. I should have thought of this before, but I was on an earlier panel today with the U.S. Embassy in Ottawa, moderating a panel of two specialists in slave plantation architecture. And one of them, Joseph McGill, talked about coming across a brick in an extant slave quarters that had the fingerprint of an enslaved laborer. And I thought, wow, right? And this just connects across all of your work, but especially Rach's in terms of the actual hand of, we have the actual imprint of the hand of that laborer. And what we have to understand too, it might not be clear to everybody, enslaved people by and large had no leisure time. All of their waking hours were devoted to the labor for the slave owners who owned them and the theft of that labor. So the fact that they're producing any material or visual culture for themselves shows that they're doing this as an assertion of resistance too, especially when you come across things like the quilts that Audrey have mentioned. It's, you know, you would have been exhausted So what little leisure time you have, which was typically on a Sunday, was a time to groom and wash and bathe yourself, do any kind of self-care and that of your kin, like, elderly, disabled people, or for instance, children. So to do on top of that, produce things for yourself, especially things that remembered your African culture, extraordinary. So we have to think of that production as a form of resistance. So I want to just throw out a couple things that some good news first. Many of you probably realize we're doing a public-facing fundraising drive for the Institute for the Study of Canadian Slavery. We launched at the beginning of February. We're trying to raise $20,000 to welcome 2 artists of residence in the academic year 2021-2022. So we'd have 10,000 each for 2 artists in residence to come be with us for a semester. So I'm really happy to announce that so far we've raised $14,000. So thank you all for your contributions, and let's see if we can hit 20 so we can get 2 brilliant artists with us in the coming year. And also I'll be giving a lecture on an introduction to Canadian slavery on Tuesday, March 2nd at 6 p.m. Atlantic Standard Time. And I believe we'll be also streaming that live on Facebook. So thank you everybody so much for attending. Thank you to President McKinnon for taking the time to be with us, and to all my wonderful colleagues. Thank you, Rach Klein. Thank you, Chris Gismondi. Thank you, Audrey authors. You're all so brilliant. Thank you for your time and your brilliant research. And thank you everyone for attending. Thanks to the brilliant simultaneous translation as well. So everybody, please have a great night, and I'll see you again soon.